Something unusual is happening in Europe right now, and it could quietly change the balance of global tech power, much faster than most people expect. Because governments across countries like Germany, France, Netherlands, and Belgium are starting to move away from American apps like WhatsApp and Signal, and here's the part almost everyone is missing. This is not being announced loudly. There is no massive headline, no dramatic press conference. Instead, it is happening quietly inside governments, system by system, decision by decision. And that is exactly what makes it so important. Because the biggest global shifts rarely start with noise, they start silently. And by the time they become visible, the change is already too far along to stop. And once shifts like this begin, they rarely go back. Now, at first, this might sound confusing, because apps like WhatsApp and Signal are already extremely secure, with end-to-end encryption. So why would governments even think about replacing them? What's the real reason behind this move? And the answer is not security, it is control. Because even if messages are encrypted, the platforms themselves are still owned and operated by organizations outside Europe, like Meta, which means the infrastructure, the data flow, and the system control ultimately sit outside European jurisdiction. And in today's geopolitical environment, that is a risk governments are no longer willing to accept. So instead of relying on external platforms, Europe is now building and adopting its own systems, apps that are controlled locally, hosted locally, and governed entirely under European laws. For example, Germany is already using Wire for secure communications among officials, while other countries are developing their own internal platforms, designed specifically for government use. And the European Commission itself is planning to fully transition to EU-controlled messaging systems by the end of 2026, which is an unusually fast timeline for institutions of this size. And this is where it starts to get more serious, because once you zoom out, this is not just about messaging apps. It is part of a much larger structural shift. Europe is slowly redesigning its entire digital infrastructure to reduce reliance on foreign powers. And messaging is just the first layer, because if you control communication, you control information flow. And if you control information flow, you influence decisions at the highest levels of power. And this is exactly where technology turns into geopolitics. Now you might be wondering what triggered this sudden urgency. Why now and not years ago? And the answer lies in a mix of rising geopolitical tension, growing concerns about data sovereignty, and a simple realization that depending too much on external systems creates long-term vulnerability. Recent cyber incidents, political uncertainty, and global power shifts have forced European leaders to rethink a critical question. What happens if the systems you rely on are controlled by someone else? And once that question becomes real, the response becomes inevitable. You build your own alternatives. And that is exactly what Europe is doing right now. But here's the part that could change everything. This shift will not stay limited to governments. Because historically, when governments move first, businesses follow. And when businesses follow, entire ecosystems begin to shift. And when that happens, the dominance of existing platforms does not collapse instantly. It starts to weaken slowly, user by user, company by company, until the tipping point is reached. And by the time that happens, the shift feels sudden, even though it took years to build. And that is how real power transitions happen in the modern world. Not through dramatic collapse, but through quiet replacement. And this is where it starts to affect more than just governments. Because if Europe successfully builds its own digital ecosystem, this could extend far beyond messaging, into cloud services, workplace tools, and entire digital networks currently dominated by American companies. And that raises a much bigger question. If one region can successfully reduce its dependence on global tech giants, what stops others from doing the same? And if that happens, the internet as we know it today could slowly fragment into regional systems, each controlled by its own rules, infrastructure, and priorities. And that would mark a fundamental shift in how global technology operates. And the most fascinating part is this: we are watching the early stage of that shift right now before it becomes obvious to everyone else. Because by the time most people notice what is happening, it may already be too late to fully understand how big this change really is. And that is exactly why this moment matters more than it seems. If you want to stay ahead of these global shifts and spot opportunities before most people even realize they exist, subscribe now. That's exactly what this channel is built.